Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God. Today I want to talk about Jesus for Jews. Now, you may have heard of an organization called Jews for Jesus. As a matter of fact, not only have I heard of them, years back when I was writing this particular book, Proof Jesus is the Messiah, I sent a draft of chapter 3 of that book to see if they had any suggestions, anything I missed or whatever. And actually they liked what I had to say mostly. And they had a couple of suggestions and told me that there were some things that we had in this particular book that they didn't know about. And there's a lot of traditions regarding the Jews, and one of the reasons why they don't believe Jesus is Messiah. Now, if you've got this book, or if you want to read it, if you go through the first couple of chapters, you'll find out there's a couple of hundred prophecies from the Hebrew Bible, what we tend to call the Old Testament, that the New Testament shows that Jesus fulfilled. And you might say, okay, you've read those, or maybe you're not familiar with all of them. And the Jews say, now those prophecies were in the Old Testament, they don't call it the Old Testament. If prophecies were in the Scriptures, but the Gospel writers just made stuff up to say they're fulfilled, or they weren't messianic prophecies, etc. So those are some of the reasons why they don't happen to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Now this book, by the way, and if I hold up any other one, is available free online at ccog.org. Go into the Literature tab, click under Books and Booklets, you'll see our different covers of our books. We don't ask you for money, we don't ask for email address or anything, you just can read it at your leisure and see what we teach, compare it against the Bible or historical references. But today I want to talk about some things that are covered in here, and this has to do about Jesus for Jews. And in this particular sermon, I'm going to focus mostly on using Jewish writing, Jewish approved writings, which includes Jewish approved translations of, we're in the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures. So they won't say, oh, it's biased by the Church of God or by the Protestants or by the Greco-Roman Catholics. And I'm also going to cite things such as the Babylonian Talmud, not because it's always reliable, but because it can provide some historical as well as current Jewish perspectives on things such as Jesus. Now the Talmud itself consists of two parts. One is called the Mishnah, the other is called the Gemara. Now the Mishnah came first, and it was a written comprehensive compendium, if you will, of what they thought was rabbinical Judaism's oral Torah. What's an oral Torah? The Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible. The oral Torah were things that were not written there, but people presumed this is what it means, and so they kind of tried to write this stuff down. And this was written down somewhere probably around 200 AD. Some people said it started a century before. Then there's what's called the Gemara, and that's mostly commentary on the Mishnah. So step back to make sure this is really clear, in case I jumbled it up too much for you. You've got the Bible, part of the Bible called the Torah. Then you had rabbinical teachings about those things, and that became the Mishnah. Then later Jews commented about the second Jews writing about those, and that was called the Gemara. And together the Mishnah and Gemara are what's called the Talmud. And I hope that kind of clears that up. Well, as I mentioned before, this particular book has over 200 Hebrew scriptures in the first parts of it that Jesus fulfilled according to the New Testament. And so if that's the case, why don't all religious Jews believe in Jesus? Well, I'm going to go over 6 of the major arguments. I'm going to explain actually why, if Jews would believe a lot of their writings, Jews would be for Jesus. So this is Jesus. So I'm going to teach Jesus for Jews, in a sense. And if you're not Jewish, and I'm sure the bulk of people watching this are not, hopefully this will give you some better understanding as to why you should be accepting Jesus as Messiah. And even if you already do, and I presume that most of you do, you'll realize, the Jews should have as well. As a matter of fact, everybody should accept Jesus as the Messiah. So anyway, the 6 basic reasons that the Jews currently claim that they don't accept Jesus are: 1, they don't believe that all the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled were messianic. 2nd, they don't believe that the gospel accounts are accurate. 3rd, they believe that there are key messianic prophecies that Jesus did not fulfill, therefore he couldn't be the Messiah. 4th, they believe that Christians misunderstood the timing of Daniel chapter 9. 5th, they rely on a lot of post-biblical traditions. And number 6 is they see a lot of errors in what's commonly called Christianity. I wasn't going to point this one out, but here we have a pretty thick book here called Beliefs of the Original Catholic Church. Now, if you see the Greco-Roman Catholic churches these days and how they act, and that they're basically they have all kinds of idols or icons in their buildings, that Jews have a problem with that. Or if you look at the Protestants, we've got a book on Protestantism as well. This is what Jews tend to think of as Christianity. They see people bowing down before crosses or other icons. They see a warring religion. It's not what Jesus had promoted. They see other things. They see anti-Semitism. Martin Luther, who's shown here, over on this cover, was an anti-Semite. He hated the Jews. The Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox have had a long history of having poor relationship often with the Jews and supporting persecution of the Jews. So the Jews see that, they call that Christianity, but that's actually not real Christianity. If you're a Jew or a Gentile, a Protestant or a Greco-Roman Catholic, or none of the above, if you read these books, these will help you know the history of true Christianity and what true Christians actually believed, and then you would realize that no, Protestants don't really stand for sola scriptura, and no, the Greco-Roman Catholics don't hold the original faith, amongst other things. All right. Anyway, as far as the Jews' belief that some of the prophecies were not messianic, I want to read Isaiah 55. I'm going to read verses 8 and 9. And this is from the Jewish Publication Society translation. So probably a little different than what most of you have. This is from God to humankind. And God is also including the Jews in this. God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. So as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Many Jews and others don't believe that a lot of the prophecies Jesus fulfilled had to do with coming Messiah. But that doesn't mean that they weren't. The fact that God's thoughts and God's ways are higher than ours hopefully will give everyone, Jews and non-Jews, Israelites, non-Israelites, reason to consider that perhaps they should give further consideration to those prophecies that they don't think are messianic. Now, having said that, I want to read something from the Jewish Encyclopedia, because the Jews do acknowledge that Jesus lived, that he was killed. Here's what the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 says. Jesus, founder of Christianity, born at Nazareth around 2 BC, executed at Jerusalem the 14th of Nisan, which would be Passover. We're not totally sure what year Jesus was born, but we do know that yes, Jesus was killed on the biblical Passover. Now, even though there's some prophecies they say aren't messianic if Jesus fulfilled, one of the biggest issues they actually have against Jesus' messiahship is they claim that the Messiah was not supposed to suffer and die. Now, Christians assert, yes, those are messianic prophecies, and Jesus did fulfill those. Oddly, the Jewish Encyclopedia goes as far as to assert the following. Yet, it would almost appear that, in one sense, the word Jesus regarded himself as fulfilling some of the prophecies that were taken among the contemporary Jews applied to Messiah. It's doubtful whether it was a later tradition or his own statements that identified him with the servant of Yahweh, represented in Isaiah 53. But there appears to be no evidence. Actually, I have this bolded in the book. This is the part that's absurd. They said, there appears to be no evidence of any Jewish conception of the Messiah suffering through and for his people. Though there's possibly a conception of him suffering with his people. This is one of the things that gets me when I watch the news sometimes. I hear that they say, well, there's no evidence of this, or such and such. There's evidence of certain things the news says there's no evidence for. They just may not agree with the evidence, and maybe the evidence isn't conclusive. And here, the idea that there's no Jewish conception of that the Messiah could be a suffering servant. That's what this is asserting in 1906, and many Jews believe that today, but it's not true. Now, this Jewish position, by the way, is not based on scriptures. There's no scripture that says, by the way, the Messiah will not suffer and die. But basically, it's based on Jewish tradition. And Jesus in Matthew 15 warned about accepting Jewish tradition when it was in conflict with Scripture. And Isaiah 8:14, Jewish Publication Society, Isaiah foretold, says, he shall be for a sanctuary, just talking about Jesus, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense, both to both houses of Israel, for a gin and a snare to the heavens of Jerusalem. So in other words, this prophecy in Isaiah says that the Jews aren't going to get it all. And sadly, we knew that would be correct, but doesn't mean no Jews can get it, because some do understand, and some children of Israel do understand. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, the Apostle Paul specifically wrote that Jesus was a stumbling block to the Jews, and that has been the case. Now, in one respect, the Jewish Encyclopedia was right. The idea of a suffering Messiah is not a Jewish conception. Why? Because it was conceived by God as the first and indispensable part of his plan of salvation for humankind. It was laid before the foundations of the world. The idea of a suffering Messiah is clearly biblical. And you can show this from not just the New Testament, but from the Hebrew Scriptures. The assertion that, quote, there appears to be no evidence of any Jewish conception of the Messiah suffering through and for his people, end quote, that's false. Actually, various Jewish scholars have concluded that there was a Messiah who would suffer and die, and one who would reign. I'd like to read something from a Hungarian a Jewish author by the name of Raphael Patai. Messiah ben Joseph. Ben means son. So, Messiah, son of Joseph, also called Messiah ben Ephraim, referring to his ancestor Ephraim, the son of Joseph, is imagined as the first commander of the army of Israel in the Messianic Wars. He will achieve many signal victories, but his fate is to die at the hands of Armilus in the great battle of which Israel is defeated by Gog and Magog. His corpse is left unburied in the streets of Jerusalem for 40 days. Neither beast nor bird of prey touches it. Then Messiah ben David comes. And his first act is to bring about the resurrection of his tragic forerunner. So I just read that the Jews talk about two types of messiahs. One is called Messiah, son of Joseph, and the other Messiah, son of David. One's killed, the other gets him resurrected. So this is certainly a Jewish conception. Now, it's not exactly what the Bible says, but some parts are consistent. Anyway, this one article says, scholars have repeatedly speculated about the origin of Messiah ben Joseph legend, and the curious fact that the Messiah figure has thus been split in two. This would seem to be an early legend. The death of the Messiah was envisioned perhaps as a development of the suffering servant motive. A prophecy in Daniel is the earliest source speaking of the death of the Messiah, the anointed. 62 prophetic weeks after his coming, after the return and rebuilding of Jerusalem. Well, it appears Daniel had a temporal ruler in mind, whom he calls the anointed prince. Later, the author of 4 Ezra, now 4 Ezra, by the way, is not in the Bible. There's a book called Ezra in the Bible, 4 Ezra is not. It says the author of 4 Ezra, which is written by a Jew, I believe, refers to the Messiah, belief in whom had developed in the meantime, and he puts words in the mouth of God to the effect that after 400 years, my son, the Messiah, will die. This is 4th Ezra, chapter 7, verses 27 to 30. Again, I'm going through an article from a Jewish writer here. When the death of the Messiah became an established tenet in Talmudic times, this was felt to be irreconcilable with the belief of the Messiah as Redeemer, who would usher in a blissful millennium of the Messianic age. So look, this Jewish writer is saying that the idea of a suffering Messiah is in the Hebrew Scriptures. He mentioned Daniel, but we talked about the suffering servant, that's a reference to Isaiah. And in Talmudic times. So for the Jewish Encyclopedia in 1906, to say that there was no Jewish conception of a suffering Messiah, that is simply not the case. The facts are there. So anyway, this writer says the dilemma was solved by splitting the person Messiah into 2. One called Messiah ben Joseph, who will raise the armies of Israel against their enemies, and after victories and miracles, who falls at Gog and Magog. The other, Messiah ben David, will come after him, bring him back to life, and that Israel will have ultimate victory. The splitting of the Messiah into 2 persons, which took place in the Talmudic period, achieved another purpose besides solving the dilemma of the slain Messiah. According to the old tradition, the Messiah was perfectly prefigured in Moses, but Moses died before he could lead the children of Israel into the land of promise. Consequently, for the parallel to be complete, the Messiah too had to die before accomplishing his task of ultimate redemption. And by the way, I'm going to digress for a second. I need to digress a lot. As far as ultimate redemption, I want to point out that God does have a plan to offer salvation to all. Some of these calling now, and all others who will be offered salvation in the age to come. So God really does have a plan for ultimate salvation. And this particular book, which is a lot thicker than this one, this particular book has hundreds of scriptures, many from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, explaining how God's ultimate plan for salvation is going to work, which was actually, by the way, a belief of the original Catholic Church. Some of the Greek Orthodox still believe it, by the way, but the Protestants and Roman Catholics have discounted that part of God's plan. But the Jews think there's some version of it, they just are not sure, they're not sure how it's going to happen. So for people to suggest that no Jewish scholars felt that the Messiah could suffer and die is absolutely false. Again, I just read from a Jewish source. This comes from his Patai's book, The Messiah Text, Jewish Legends of 3,000 Years. It was published by Wayne State University Press in 2015. So again, 21st century scholar says, no, actually, no, the Jews did teach that the Messiah could die and that he would suffer. Now, also, you say, well, maybe they just made that up, and it wasn't really from really ancient times. Well, there's actually a hint associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls that God's anointed was going to suffer, based on what was written in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14. So this is I want to read something that was published here. It says, Isaiah 52:14 includes an obscure legend, and talk about the anointed. It says, I have anointed his appearance beyond that of any person, other man, his form beyond that of humanity. And the other textual overtones bring the passage to connection with anointing. You can't really read this, it was from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and by the way, it's also in this book. And I will comment that the Dead Sea Scrolls were from Jewish, not Christian sources. And most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were believed to be written before Jesus was born. The portion I just read came from what's called the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it was believed to be written 100 years before Jesus was born. So yes, they had stuff about the suffering back then. Furthermore, there's another document. It's called the Targum Jonathan. And then in that, there's a portion called the Targum Isaiah. Now the Targums, by the way, were written mainly in Arabic. And they were basically spoken paraphrases, explanations, and expansions of scriptures. And this became developed by the Jews shortly before the time of Jesus. So this actually could have been a predecessor to the writings of the Talmud. Anyway, the Targums probably received the bulk of their editing in written form during the 2nd century and were considered complete by the 4th century. Anyway, let me read something from Targum Jonathan regarding Isaiah 52 verse 13. Here's how he puts it. Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be exalted, extolled, and be very strong. Okay, well, the Targum Jonathan has lots of issues. You say, well, that passage just says the Messiah will be strong. It shows that at least one Jew thought Isaiah 52 had messianic implications. And when you tie that in with Isaiah 52 verse 14, and I'm going to read this from the Jewish Publication Society, it says, appalling as many were appalled at thee, so marred was his visage, unlike that of a man, his form unlike the son of man. So we see from Isaiah, okay, this about his visage, how he looks, being marred. Jesus was beaten. And since the Targum Jonathan says Isaiah 52:13 had to do with the Messiah, it follows the next verse, 52:14, has to do with the Messiah. Because that's who he was. So it's in ancient Jewish literature. So to suggest that there was no conception of this, it just makes no sense. Now I want to read something from the Talmud that cites Isaiah 53 verse 4. This is from what's called Sanhedrin 93b. Rabbi Gidel says, of the Rab's name, the Jews are destined to eat their fill in the day of the Messiah. Rabbi Joseph demurred, is this not obvious? Who else should eat? Rab said, the world was created only on David's account. Samuel said, on Moses' account. Rabbi Jonathan said, for the sake of the Messiah. What's the Messiah's name? The school of Rabbi Shelah says his name shall be Shiloh. It's written until Shiloh comes. The school of Rabbi Yanai says his name is Yinon, for it's written his name shall be endure forever. The school of Rabbi Hananan maintains his name is Hanani, which I will not give you Hana. Others say his name is Menachem, son of Hezekiah, for it's written because Menachem the comforter would relieve my soul so far. The rabbi said his name is leper scholar. It's written, surely he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did not esteem him, smitten of God and afflicted. Why did I say that? They're talking about the Messiah. These are supposed to be about the Messiah. So we've got from the Talmud, which specifically says that he will be smitten and afflicted. Continuing in this one from Talmud, Rabbi Naaman says, if he, the Messiah, is of those living today, it might be like myself, as is written, and their nobles shall be of themselves, and their governors shall proceed from the midst of them. If he was of the living, he'd be our holy master. So before we go any further, what they're basically saying is, he looked like a regular person. And Jesus did. And then in Sanhedrin, from the Talmud, 97b, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer said, but it isn't already stated, so says the Lord, Redeemer of Israel, his Holy One, to him who is despised of man, to him who is abhorred of the nation, to be a servant of rulers. Again, those are messianic prophecies. So if you're a Jew and you've been told there's nothing to do with the Messiah suffering in our literature or anything like that, that's simply not true. It reminds me of a lot of things we've, again, been hearing on the news these days about there's no evidence of this or there's no proof of this, and other odd claims that people will make. Instead of saying there's evidence that we don't agree with, they just want you to think there's no possibility that there's any evidence. And again, the Jewish Encyclopedia was wrong. There's plenty of evidence about the Messiah being a suffering servant, based on, again, prophecies in both Isaiah and Daniel, plus the Targums, plus the Talmud, and again, the Dead Sea Scroll. Let's just see here. Now, there's something called the Zohar tradition, which is, according to this Jewish writer, is one of the comparatively less censored rabbinical sources. It has its own material on the messianic interpretation of Isaiah 53. One of the Zohar's thoughts on Isaiah 53 speaks about the Messiah as follows. It says, "The departed souls will arrive and tell the Messiah about their lives, and when he described to them the sufferings which Israel is undergoing in her dispersion, that they are guilty because they don't wish to know their Lord, he will raise up his voice and weep on behalf of those who are guilty of this. For it's written, he was pierced for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities." That's exactly what we true Christians teach about Jesus. It was prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures, and Jesus fulfilled that in the New Testament. And then it says, their souls will stand up in the post, talking about a house of stick. "In that day the Messiah will enter that castle and shout, 'May all the sickness and pains of Israel come upon me.' And they will come." The Bible says, "By his stripes we were healed," in Isaiah 53. Anyway, if he did not relieve Israel's pains and take them up upon himself, no one would be able to suffer on behalf of Israel's oppression, of which is written in the Torah. As it is written, in truth he did bear our sicknesses. So we can see both of the Zohar as well as the Talmud, I'm reading from a Jewish source here, are depicting the Messiah as a pre-existent figure who shares and carries our sufferings and even the sins of Israel in her dispersion. This comes from Rabbi Santala. This is called the Midrash of the Messiah, and that was published in 2002. The information is there. So if you end up talking to somebody who's Jewish and they say, "Oh, there's no suffering, the Messiah, whatever, that wasn't supposed to happen," I encourage you to give them a copy of this book, him or her a copy of this book, and say, "Just please read chapter 3. It's not a very long chapter. Just read chapter 3. After you read chapter 3, then if you want to read chapters 1 and 2 and all the rest, that would be fine. But chapter 3 addresses Jewish objections to Jesus. Now, we read some other things that Isaiah 53, this is from a Hebrew Jewish source, has been omitted from the annual reading of the prophets. But there's something from a prayer book that says, before the creation, he already set up the temple and the Messiah. The Messiah, our righteousness, has turned away from us. We are shaking. We can find no one who can justify us. The yoke of our sins and transgressions is a burden to us. He was wounded for our transgression. He suffered on his shoulders our iniquities. Again, that's the prophecy in Isaiah 53. There's forgiveness of our sins. That's what we, Continuing Church of God, teach through Jesus. In his wounds we're healed. Okay, and this is again from Santala, quoting this particular prayer. So there's lots of reasons to conclude that early Jews did believe that some of the passages in Isaiah chapters 52 and chapters 53 were messianic. Denying that in the 20th or 21st century doesn't change historical facts. The fact is that atonement prayer I was just reading supports the idea of a second coming of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I think that's interesting. And here's something else that actually Ristos Centala translated from something called Bruce Rabbah. The kingdom taken from him for a time, he was restored to his kingdom. Now that particular writing, Jewish writing, is consistent with a second coming of Jesus. Jews should also consider scriptures from Genesis 4 on, showing that sacrifices were carried out. You've got the powerful story of Abraham and Isaac. You've also got the 22nd Psalm that shows agonizing suffering that the Messiah would go through. Now I'm going to go to Isaiah 53, starting verse 9. To read, and this is from the complete Jewish Bible. There was someone prophesied to be the guilt offering and to suffer for the sins of others. Isaiah 53, verse 9. He was given a grave among the wicked. In his death, he was with a rich man. We know that happened with Jesus. And though he did no violence and said nothing deceptive, yet it pleased Adonai, the mighty one, to crush him with illness, to see if he would present himself as a guilt offering. If he does, he'll see his offspring and he'll prolong his days. And at his hands, the Almighty's desire will be accomplished. After this ordeal, he will see satisfaction. But as knowing pain and sacrifice, my servant makes many righteous. It is for their sins he suffers. This is from the complete Jewish Bible translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So the idea of human sacrifice for sins of others is not some Christian idea thing that was made up by the gospel writers. Furthermore, the Talmud, it's actually claimed that the Messiah, the son of Joseph, would be killed. It talks about the land will eulogize. And they cite Zechariah 12:12. And the Gemara asks, for what is the nature of this eulogy? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Dosas and rabbis disagree on the matter. One says the eulogy is for the Messiah ben Joseph who was killed. Prior to the ultimate redemption of the coming of the Messiah ben David. And the other said the eulogy is for that evil inclination was killed. So they're saying, okay, there's a eulogy mentioned in Zechariah 12:12. So the rabbis think this has to do with Messiah ben Joseph. And then later will come Messiah ben David. The Gemara asks, and by the way, if you want to look this up, this is in Sukkah 52a. Granted, according to the one who said that the lament is for Messiah ben Joseph, who was killed, that this would be the meaning that was written in the context. And they shall look upon me because they have thrust him through, and they shall mourn for him as one who mourns his only son. Now, while the timing of the Gemara is not right, this is proof the claim that the Messiah was supposed to suffer and die is not just some Christian conception. And again, ben Joseph means son of Joseph. Now I want to read something from a Jewish writer by the name of Israel Noel. And this was published in Biblical Archaeology Review in September-October 2008. According to the 7th century apocalyptic text known as Sefer Zerubbabel, the Messiah, son of Joseph, was killed by the wicked Armilus, and was further resurrected by Messiah, son of David, and the prophet Elijah. Some evidence, however, indicates this figure of Messiah, son of Joseph, is much older. In some texts around the turn of the era, we encounter Joseph as a son of God who atones for the sin of others with his suffering. The turn of the era, by the way, that means around 2,000 years ago when we switched from AD to BC. For example, Joseph in Asna was written between 100 BC in 115 CE, or what we call AD. Joseph is described as a son of God. Joseph is called God's firstborn son. Now these are Jewish writings around the time of Jesus that probably preceded him, that prophesied that the son of Joseph would be, the one called the son of Joseph would be God's firstborn son, and he would die. That's what happened. Jesus died, let's say 31 AD, maybe 35 AD, somewhere in that time frame. Furthermore, the same Jewish writer wrote in another book in the Second Temple period called Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. The Testament of Benjamin connects Joseph figure with the suffering servant in Isaiah 52 and 3. In this testament, Jacob says to Joseph, "You'll be fulfilled the heavenly prophecy which says, spotless one will be defiled by lawless men, and the sinless one will die for the sake of impious men." According to the New Testament, Jesus was the only sinless man, and here's a prophecy written thousands of years ago about this. Anyways, this again is published in Biblical Archaeology Review. It says, these citations suggest the designation of the suffering Messiah as son of Joseph goes back to sources from the Second Temple period. The Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in August of the year 70. So you're talking for probably centuries before then that this all came out. This was not some Christian idea that they just made up, that the gospel writers made up. This was in the Jewish period. Now the Second Temple period actually ran from 530 BC or BCE to 70 AD or BC, CE. Furthermore, in the first century before Christ, or before the Common Era, as the Jews like to call it, there's a Jewish tablet called the Jellison Stone. It has something called Gabriel's Revelation. And it says, "My holy thing for Israel. By 3 days you shall know this, said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, that evil has been broken before righteousness." Now we know Jesus was killed and resurrected 3 days later. Continuing, he says, "From before of you the three signs three. In 3 days live. I, Gabriel, command you, the Prince of Princes, the tongue of the rocky crevices, to the visions, their tongue, those who love me." Okay. Now I want to read some things that the Jewish Talmud scholar Israel Knoll wrote about that. It's the first mention of the slain Messiah, called Messiah ben Yosef, which means Messiah, son of Joseph, is in the Talmud, Sukkah 52a. I believe the sentence can be reconstructed as follows. In 3 days live, I, Gabriel, command you. The archangel is ordering someone to rise from the dead within 3 days. To whom is he speaking? Who is the Prince of Princes? The answer seems to be in the following line. Sentence reads, this leader will be resurrected in 3 days. The primary source for the Gabriel revelation is a narrative of the book of Daniel, chapter 8, in which the archangel Gabriel reveals himself to Daniel for the first time. Was this Prince of Princes a historical figure? I believe he was, Knoll says. Now this is from an article called "In 3 Days You Shall Live." This is actually published by the Israel paper Haaretz, April 19th, 2007. Now, it turns out Israel Knoll doesn't accept Jesus as Messiah, but what he wrote supports the idea that the Jews did believe that there was a prince who would die and 3 days later be resurrected. If you're Jewish, do you know that? Or have you discounted all this stuff? Or should you? I also think it's interesting that the Messiah is tied in with the angel Gabriel, because in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel, Gabriel is there and he announces the coming of the Messiah to Mary. And she accepted that. Oh, and I also, by the way, I went and looked up some more on this and looked at the Hebrew letters and found out that some scholars say, I command you, Actually, the two letters can be translated as don't. So Gabriel may have been stating he doesn't command the Messiah. So I don't think, obviously Gabriel couldn't command the resurrection. Because Scripture shows it was God the Father, not an archangel, that raised Jesus from the dead. Be that as it may, the fact is that the Jews had some idea prior to Jesus that somebody was going to die and be raised in 3 days. And some have also seen some of this from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what about these claims, the Jewish claims that the gospel accounts are inaccurate? Let me read what the Jewish Encyclopedia says on that. Many incidents were actually invented, especially in Matthew, in order that there might be fulfilled in him prophecies relating to a Messiah character quite other than that which Jesus claimed or was represented by his disciples to be. That's one of the reasons why, despite the fact there are 200 prophecies, over 200 prophecies in the Old Testament that pointed to Jesus, the Jews discount it. Because they think that the gospel writers were not faithful, and they just made this stuff up. Now, however, that doesn't prove anything for a couple of reasons. One, they can't prove that they made it up. By the way, they just make that assertion. Just like they asserted there was no conception of a suffering Messiah in Jewish literature or anything, which is not true. But also, there are prophecies in the New Testament that have been fulfilled since the New Testament was written. And therefore, those should give people pause to consider, wait a second. This stuff could be true and it could be from God. Furthermore, I want to read what the gospel writer Luke wrote. Luke chapter 1. From the New King James, because there wouldn't be necessarily a Jewish translation of this. Verse 1. Inasmuch as many have taken on hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to them, to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things of which you were instructed. So Luke is saying this is for certain. This is not made up stuff. Of course, you say, well, I'm Jewish and I don't want to believe that. Well, whatever. In Mark 16, verse 20, we read, it says, they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them, confirming the word through accompanies and signs. And in John's account, John 21, verse 24 said that he was a disciple who testifies to these things and wrote these things, and we know his testimony is true. John said, I didn't lie about this stuff. Now, consider that these writers all lived the Christian faith until they died. Seems to be illogical to make up parts of the writing, particularly since they insisted that they wrote the truth. The same can be said as far as Matthew. Now, the Jews don't accept the virgin birth, and that we read about in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 1. Instead, they've got some legends about it. They say the earliest authenticated passage ascribing illegitimate birth to Jesus is that in Yeb 4:3. The mysterious man cited in this passage, according to a family register, which Rabbi Simeon ben Azza is said to have found, seems to indicate that it refers to Jesus. Okay? Now, I'm going to read the Talmudic reference that the Jewish Encyclopedia is referring to. Said Rabbi Simeon ben Azza, I found a roll of genealogical records in Jerusalem, and therein was written, so-and-so who was illegitimately born from a forbidden union with a married woman, which confirms the view of Rabbi Joshua. Now, I will say that Jesus was not born in Jerusalem. We read that in Matthew 2, verse 1. Nor of an adulterous woman. It's possible, though, his genealogical records could have somehow ended up in Jerusalem, which is the capital city. Now, the New Testament records that the Jews did question the legitimacy of his birth. You can see that in John 8:41. So that writing in the Talmud is consistent with that. Some Jews have claimed that there's different genealogies in Matthew and Luke, so that shows a conflict between the gospel writers. But there's a logical reason for the partially differing genealogies. Matthew provided a legal genealogy through Mary's husband, Joseph, whereas Luke provided a physical genealogy through the family of Jesus' mother, Mary. They're not in conflict. Now, some Jews have claimed that the census that was described in Luke chapter 2 didn't happen. But we have a full discussion of that census in chapter 5 of this book if you want to read it. Now, Jewish scholars tend to claim that Jewish writings showing miracles by Jesus were either changed by believers in Jesus, or they're written too late to be accurate, or they're simply written down to reflect what Christians claimed. However, the Talmud said Yeshu, meaning Jesus, practiced sorcery. And so the fact that they say Jesus practiced sorcery means they are basically admitting that Jesus did some kind of miracles or things that look like miracles. Now, by the way, some wonder why we don't use the term Yeshua. And it's because the New Testament was written in Greek. And his name in Greek doesn't transfer over quite the way you would think. When you read the Greek, it comes out to Iusus, or something close to that, as opposed to Yeshua. And when the English language changed how to pronounce certain words, for certain letters, we now use the term Jesus. Now, the term Yeshua or Joshua just simply does not translate into Greek exactly. And what about the term Christ? That's a translation of the Hebrew term for the Messiah. And you can read that. It actually says that in John 1:41. It says, "We have found Christ," which is we have found the Messiah, which is translated by Christ. Now that word translated Messiah, when I look at the Greek, you can just read it. If you can read Greek, it does say Messiah. You might pronounce it slightly different, well, like Messiah, but it's pretty close to that. Anyway, there's a Jewish Talmudic source that claims that Jesus, who they call Ben Stada here, learned magic spells in Egypt. And we do know that Jesus went to Egypt. It's taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Eliezer said to the rabbis, "Didn't the infamous Ben Stada take up magic spells out of Egypt and scratch on his flesh?" That's not... Incidentally, the Gemara asks, why did they call him Ben Stada when he was the son of Pandaria? Jesus said his mother's husband, who acted as his father, was named Stada, but the one who had relationship with his mother and fathered him was named Pandaria. So let me just interject here. So in one respect, they're saying Jesus, when he went to Egypt, he must have learned miracles and stuff, sorcery there, because they're admitting Jesus did miracles. They're also admitting the gospel is true. It counts that Joseph did not know his wife Mary until after Jesus was born. Because now they're claiming, of course, it wasn't God the Father and the Holy Spirit that conceived Jesus. Then it says, wasn't his mother Miriam who braided women's hair? The name Mary, by the way, is frequently used. Miriam's is basically what that name is. Now, the Jewish Encyclopedia had another section. It says, Jesus as magician. According to Celsus and to the Talmud, Jesus learned magic in Egypt and performed his miracles by means of that. It may be assumed that when it says Jesus healed the sick in the name of Jesus Pandera, it may be assumed that its author held that the miracles of Jesus also to have been miraculous cures. So they admit that Jesus had miraculous cures. So they admit that he did a lot of these things the gospel said. Now, secular Jews don't believe any miracles, and they'll say, okay, look, the gospel said Jesus healed these people, did the miracles. Miracles don't happen, therefore they discount it. Okay, well, people like that also have a tendency not to believe the Hebrew scriptures that said God did all kinds of miracles. And if you believe that God can do miracles, which if you believe in the all-powerful God, you certainly should, then you'd have no doubts that Jesus could do miracles. And the fact is that Jewish sources said that Jesus did miracles, including healing the sick. Now, what are considered unfulfilled messianic prophecies are actually a major reason that Jews give for not accepting Jesus. Now, here's something. I went to a website called Judaism 101. The messianic idea in Judaism says concept was introduced during the age of the prophets. The messianic concept, they said, is not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, that's not true. Moses referred to a prophet that would rise up like him, and we also have the account with God telling Adam and Eve about the Messiah, but ignoring that part. It says, however, traditional Judaism maintains that the messianic idea was always part of Judaism, and some things have to do with the end of days. The term Messiah literally means the anointed one. The Messiah will be a great political leader descended from King David. Jesus was. The Messiah is often referred to as Messiah ben David, the son of David, which Jesus was. He'll be well versed in Jewish law and observant of his commandments. And Jesus was. Jesus specifically said he kept his father's commandments. Others will follow him. He will be a great military leader who will win battles for Israel. He'll be a great judge who makes righteous decisions. Well, as far as being a great military leader, that will come. If you read the book of Revelation, chapter 19, you see that. But of course, the Jews don't accept that. Above all, he'll be a human, not a god, a demigod, or other supernatural being. Well, actually, the Bible points otherwise, as do some other Jewish writings. And of course, the New Testament shows that Jesus is now divine. When will the Messiah come? They're not sure. Basically, one of the issues that Jews have is because various ones claim to be a Messiah, so they're not sure when the Messiah would come. There was actually a rabbi, Chaim Kanievsky, who claimed that Messiah was born on July 21st, 2018, by the way. Anyway, unfulfilled messianic prophecies, or what they consider unfulfilled messianic prophecies, are the biggest reason that the Jews don't believe that about Jesus. Anyway, Judaism 101 listed a bunch of scriptures, but they left things out because Jesus fulfilled prophecies in Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 42 and other parts of scriptures. And as far as some other prophecies coming to pass, Jesus said God would intervene because of the coming tribulation, and that would be related to fulfillment of Jeremiah chapter 30. So the listing of scriptures from Judaism 101 doesn't disprove it. And again, they're all listed in this book. Again, you can find this at www.ccog.org. Let's go to Zechariah 9, verse 9. I'm going to read this from the Complete Jewish Bible. Rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Zion. Shout out loud, daughter of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous. He is victorious. Yes, he's humble. He's riding on a donkey. Yes, on a lowly donkey's colt. That's from Complete Jewish Bible. So the fact that he had to come all the time as a conquering king and warrior is simply not true. And here's Midrash Rabbah on Ecclesiastes. It tells how Rabbi Berkiah said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, just as there was a first Savior, so there'll be a last. Just as there's a first Savior, Exodus 4:20, he took his wife and sons, put them on donkeys. So it said the last Savior, that he is lowly riding on a donkey. Rav Yosef says, "May the Master forgive Rabbi Hillel for stating matters with no basis. Regarded Hezekiah when he was supposed to reign for his temple period, whereas Zechariah ben Berechiah the prophet prophesied during the second temple period, said, 'Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king will come to you. He is just and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, upon a colt, foal of a donkey.'" Zechariah 9:9. In the generation after Hezekiah, there are prophecies about both redemption and the coming of the Messiahs. So specifically, Jews are saying, just different Jews saying, this has to do with Messiah, the prophecies I read. So all the messianic prophecies were not about someone who appears powerful, but one who would be willing to ride on a donkey, which, by the way, Matthew recorded that in Matthew 21, verse 7. Daniel 9:25 makes it clear that the Messiah was first to come as a prince who would be cut off, according to various ones. He wasn't supposed to come as a conquering king. And the idea that Jesus would begin as a prince is indirectly confirmed in a prayer book of the Jews on Isaiah 63:9. The Jewish prayer book Siddur HaShalom carries a New Year prayer to go with the sounding of the shofar, the ram's horn, which the prayer speaks of Jesus, the Prince of Countenance. It says, and this is their prayer, "May it be thy will from the blast of this horn should carry to the tabernacle of God by the instrumentality of our delegate Thiel, whose name is Elias, may his memory be blessed, has given to him, and through Jesus the Prince of the Countenance and the Prince of the Metron, his great be part of it, you who are blessed of the Lord." The name Jesus appears in this prayer in its proper Hebrew form, Yeshua, which means Savior. So there's even a Hebrew prayer that talks about Jesus, the term Jesus, in it, as a prince. Now that said, there are some messianic prophecies Jesus did not completely fulfill. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 9. Starting the second half of verse 6. "Dominion will rest on his shoulders, and he will be given a name, Pela Yot Etz El Kibor Avai Ad Sar Shalom, in order to extend the dominion and perpetuate the peace of the throne and the kingdom of David, to secure it, sustain it through justice and righteousness, henceforth and forever. The zeal of the Almighty will accomplish this." Now, we as Christians know that some of these prophecies were to be fulfilled later. And various prophecies in Isaiah, for example, Isaiah 2:1-4, say they're for the end of days. According to various prophecies in the New Testament, Jesus will still fulfill various messianic prophecies that are in the Old Testament, as well as some in the New Testament. Now, misunderstanding that is more than a spiritual academic exercise. As it turns out, when influential Jewish leaders misapplied messianic prophecies in the 2nd century, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed during what was called the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, before I go further, the idea that the Messiah above all will be a human being, not a god, demigod, or other supernatural being, is not consistent with the Scriptures. But various ones related to the messianic deity would include Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah 9:6, and also Psalm 2 verse 7. They all support the idea that the Messiah would be either a god, a demigod, somehow divine. Now, interestingly, although timing is sometimes raised as objective, there's controversy on the year that Jesus was executed. There's evidence in the Talmud, by the way, that points to either 30 or 31 AD. Now, at this stage, I think 30 AD is too early. Let's go to Matthew chapter 27. Starting in verse 50, we read, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went to the holy city and appeared to many." Verse 54, "So when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" Now it appears that this quake caused the ripping or tearing of the great curtain of the temple entrance from top to bottom. And you can read about that and also in Mark 15:38 and Luke 23:45. Now geological evidence points to some type of earthquake that occurred in the area in 31 AD plus or minus 5 years in this area. The timing of the veil splitting is also consistent with the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. Christians believe that the torn veil represented the fact we're now allowed to have direct contact with God the Father through prayer, as well as the elimination of the need for animal sacrifices, since truly Jesus paid the penalty for our sins. Now, it was reported from a Christian scholar that I know that there was a sizable stone lintel supporting the curtain, which apparently tumbled into the floor below. The collapse of this lintel would have ripped the curtain in two and exposed the large doors sealing the temple's inner chamber. This person doesn't want to be mentioned, said the episode resulted in doors opening on their own accord, likely exposing the temple interior, the Holy of Holies chamber itself. Moreover, it seems that the chamber of the hall, it seems like the chamber or the hall of hewn stones built in the north wall of the temple collapsed. The Sanhedrin met in this chamber when functioning in a court, but it suffered such structural damage that the Sanhedrin had to abandon it. The Christian application by the explanation is actually consistent with something that's in the Talmud. It says the Gemara continues in question, as it is taught in a Barita. 40 years before the destruction of the second temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stones that sat in store near the Temple Mount. 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stones and sat in the stores of the Temple Mount. Now, I mentioned that the temple was destroyed. It was actually burnt on August 30th of 70 AD. And so whether or not 40 years is precise or approximate, we're not sure. If you use an inclusive manner of counting, you may get to looking at like 31 AD. And so the Jews, if Jesus was killed in 31 AD, they actually have supporting accounts in their literature that probably the veil tore or something related to that, which affected Sanhedrin back then. So if you're Jewish, you probably hadn't heard that one. And if you're not Jewish, maybe you hadn't heard that one before. Here's something else from the Talmud. So during the tenure of Simon Hadatzit, a lot for God always rose in the high priest's right hand after his death. It occurred only occasionally, but during 40 years prior to the destruction of the second temple, the lot for God did not arise on the high priest's right hand at all. So that's interesting. If this was something that happened, some miracle that happened every now and then, it stopped happening after Jesus was killed, because Jesus was the atonement sacrifice. Again, it's possible that we're talking about 31 AD there, maybe as late as 35 AD. And then it says, and the doors of the sanctuary opened by themselves, a sign that they would soon be opened by enemies. No, it was a sign that Jesus was sacrificed, and the high priest did not need to go to atone for the sins on the Day of Atonement once a year. So this is in Jewish literature. Okay, a lot of things are in there, but they don't interpret it that way. But the reality is that's what happened, and it tied in. This all ties in with Jesus. And irrespective of the things that would happen with the color changing for the high priest, because the Bible doesn't talk about that. In the Talmud, the rabbis give reasons for the destruction of the temple, such as Jewish disobedience regarding the Sabbath, having drinking parties, not properly teaching their children. There's a lack of trustworthy Jews, and Jews that said bad things about their scholars. But they didn't tie it in with Daniel chapter 9. So let me read some of what the Talmud says about this. Rabbi Yehuda said, Jerusalem was destroyed only because they disparaged the Torah scholars in it. Rav said, what's the meaning which is written? Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. Do not touch my anointed ones. These are the school children. And those do not harm my prophets. These are the Torah scholars. So they say that that's why the temple was destroyed, but the Bible doesn't say that. Here's another rabbinical view. This is from the Talmud. Why was the second temple destroyed? It was due to the fact there was wanton hatred during this period. And also it says because people weren't paying enough attention to the Torah. Now, the temple destruction came after Jesus was killed. Let's go to John 15, verse 24. Jesus said, if I had not done among them the works which no one else had done, they'd have no sin. But now they have seen and also hated me and my Father. This happened that the word might be fulfilled as written in their law. They hated me without a cause. Now, to mention that Christians believed that the Messiah came right on schedule, according to Daniel chapter 9, and that the temple destruction helps prove this. The rabbinical view is that the Messiah didn't come when he was expected because of Jewish sins. Yet the Jews should consider the destruction of the temple left them without a biblical national way of atonement and without a replacement for that system. And while the Bible does say that animal sacrifices are going to be reinstituted, in like Daniel 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11, the fact that they haven't happened yet should tell the Jews something important happened a long time ago. And this is an interesting one. This is from the Talmud, in a reference to Zechariah 9, verse 9. Rabbi Alexandre explains, if the Jewish people merit redemption, the Messiah will come in a miraculous manner in the clouds of heaven. If they don't merit redemption, the Messiah will come lowly, riding on a donkey. Now think about this. Jesus came on a donkey, but the next time he is going to come in the clouds. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But, they should, believe that Jesus came when he was supposed to come. Now, as far as the temple destruction, Jesus' timing goes, the Jews asked Jesus for a sign of his authority. Let's go to John chapter 2, starting verse 13. It says, Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, and money changers doing business. When he made a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, poured out the money changers, and overturned their tables. He said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Then his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has eaten me up. So the Jews answered, said to him, what sign do you show us since you do these things? He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. The Jews said, it's taken us 46 years to build his temple, and you'll raise it up in 3 days. But Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he'd risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said, and they believed the scriptures, what he had said. Now this gives us a few points about the timing of Jesus' ministry to connect to historical accounts outside the Bible. For example, the first century Jewish historian Josephus wrote, "Now Herod in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts mentioned, undertook a great work, that is, to build himself the temple of God, make it larger, and to raise it to a magnificent altitude, esteeming it the most glorious of all his actions, as it was to bring it to perfection that would be sufficient for the memorial of him." As far as the dating of Herod, Encyclopedia Britannica said he was appointed king of Judea 37 BCE. And the Jewish Encyclopedia says it was in the spring of the year 37 BC that he did various things. Now the 18th year of his reign would be from around 20 to 19 BC. Now, if you add 46 years to that, plus you've got to add 1 because there's no year 0 when you go from AD to BC, you get to date 28 AD. This would be Jesus' first Passover of his 3.5-year ministry, which he began around age 30. And then 3 years later, he would come to cleanse the temple for a second time, prior to his death, which it may have been 31 AD. So the timing of Herod and Jesus' death are all consistent with this. Now, interestingly, the Jews have something that they should rely on. This is from Hosea chapter 6. It says, "After 2 days he'll revive us, and on the 3rd day he'll raise us up, that we may live in his presence." So again, we hear about this 3-day resurrection concept, and the Jews have other explanations of that, which I'm going to go to in a future sermon. The reality is there are hundreds of scriptures in the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, that Jesus fulfilled. Jewish writings admit that Jesus did miracles. Other Jewish writings do say that he was supposed to be a suffering servant, and other writings say he would come again in glory, and he will. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about Jesus for Jews. And again, more can be found in our free book, Proof Jesus is Messiah, available online at ccog.org. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.